Hi everyone, this is Mrs. Bustamante, and in this video we're going to talk about 7.6, which is evidence for evolution, and 7.7, which is common ancestry, which to me kind of always go together. They're basically how do we relate organisms to each other and what scientific evidence do we use to come up with these relationships. So here we go. We're actually going to talk about these different ways of evidence to support evolution, right? Why do scientists think that this is happening, right? And how do we make these connections between changes over time, right? We're going to talk about biogeographical evidence, fossil records, anatomical records, development, biochemical, and of course, molecular records. And then really, how do we take all that together and use it to relate organisms to each other to figure out what is a common ancestor or not, essentially. So what's our biogeographical evidence? Well, biogeography studies the range and geographical distribution of life forms on Earth. So it can study migration patterns. It can talk about how evolution is linked to climate and geological forces, especially plate tectonics is a good example, which may help explain why we see many ancestral relationships and geographic distributions in fossils of living organisms today. Sometimes why we even see convergent evolution, basically things changing in the same way, but not necessarily for the same function, or for the same function, but maybe not even related to each other, right? So when we think about this, remember our idea of plate tectonics, right? There are plates that make up the Earth one time, and they move over time. One time, right, we think, in fact, that they were all together as part of Pangea. So maybe sometimes why we see similar organisms in similar places is because they actually at one time would have been able to migrate between those two places and access them, and then perhaps they changed and became differentiated, right, as they no longer had access to the same places, but why we might see similarities geographically around the world. Now, something to note, there is such thing as an endemic species. These are actually some kind of really large lizards that are found in the Galapagos Islands. In fact, Darwin experienced them, right? But they're pretty much just found there and nowhere else in the world that we know of. So those also exist, and that can have something to do with our biogeographical evidence as well, right? Why we might not see them other places is perhaps because they're very isolated or something. So fossils actually play a big role in helping us put together the pieces of evolution, right? Especially before we knew so much about DNA and chromosomes, and we could look at them and really analyze even the molecular code of an individual organism, right? Fossils were kind of how we connected lots of things together. So layers of sedimentary rock contain what we call fossils, and they're basically the remains or traces of past life, right? In order to classify as a fossil, technically you have to be 10,000 years old. And new layers will cover old layers. So at the top is the most recent, down lower would be older, right? And within those, we see fossils of what was once living organisms, right? And then we can date those fossils by a variety of different methods. We can look at the age of the rocks where the fossil is found. We can rate the decay of isotopes, including carbon-14, and we can look at geographical data. What do these mean? Well, age of the rocks, we can date the rocks. We can look at how the layers have formed. That gives us an idea of time scale, right? Carbon decay of isotopes. Isotopes, actually carbon-14 in particular, we know how long it takes to basically go from a half-life to half as much. And we can look at how much carbon-14 is in something to give it a date, right, of it. And then geographical data, just how do we place where this was, when it was in time, and use that to give us information about the fossils. So sometimes when we look at fossils, we think like, here's a species, here's a species. But something we want to think about and talk about is something called transitional fossils. And these are sort of fossils that link some bridges, if you will, to us. They might resemble two groups that are currently classified separately. And so oftentimes they kind of represent what would be like an intermediate. And sometimes people will like to point to like that there's not these transitional fossils, and so evolution isn't happening as kind of a way to say that evolution doesn't exist, right? Well, here's kind of the tricky part about fossils. They have to have been preserved, right? And we as humans have to find them. So in a sense, maybe more transitional fossils are there, or there were more transitional organisms, but we can't find them or we don't know about them, right? However, there actually are a lot of transitional fossils out there. Like here are some that show us how we would go from fish to amphibian to reptile, and we can kind of see them linked together. Another thing about transitional fossils, if you're looking at how you got necessarily from maybe like one species, if you will, to another, well, you're going through a transition, right, which didn't survive, which wasn't particularly well adapted for a given environment. So maybe there's not as many of them, or they never really made it, weren't around very long when we go looking for them. Something that's kind of interesting when we look at fossils and changes in horses over time, we can look at how they have changed kind of into what we know them today, and how they used to be sort of like much smaller and have a little bit different characteristics. And this really has to do with the environment that they lived in, right? Were they in a place where there was short brush? They didn't have to go over lots of tall things. Maybe they could be shorter. And now they look quite different, right? So I think horses is a really good thing to look at the fossils of over time to be pretty relatable to us. So we can also look at what we call anatomical records, and we're going to talk about homologous structures here. Basically, we're looking at parts of organisms, right? And we say homologous structures are similar in characteristics resulting from a common ancestor. Basically, what means that they have the same anatomy, but they might not necessarily have the same function. Sometimes they don't even use them. Basically, they're not using them the same way, even though they kind of look the same. So they have similar structures, but they have different functions. They might even have similar development, and typically speaking, they have a fairly recent common ancestor, which in your and I lifetime still seems like a long way away, but common ancestor. So homologous, similar structure, different function. Here we can look at whales and cat and the horse and the bird and the bat. We can all see that they have things in common, like the humerus, the ulna, the radius, phalanges, right? All these things are colored the same. They have the same structures, but even if we just think about them now, right? Well, we know that those organisms all use them in different ways, right? A bat, a bird, and a horse aren't really using them in the same function. We can also see this in plants when we look at things like leaves on a leaf that we think of versus succulent leaves versus spines. They have commonalities and yet differences as well in how they use them. Okay, something to think about. Homologous structures shouldn't be confused with analogous structures. Analogous structures are similar characteristics. They have the same anatomy and they have similar functions, but they do not have a common ancestor. So basically, they don't have an evolutionary relationship to each other. We had like convergent evolution. They have evolved similar solutions to similar problems, but they're not related to each other. Things that work this way, or we see this in birds, butterflies, bats, right? They all have wings and they all fly, but they are not related to each other. Also things that swim, if you will. We have a shark, we have a penguin, and we have a dolphin, right? They have similar structures, but they are not ancestors of each other, if you will, or close ancestors. Also, when we're looking at anatomical records, we can look at vestigial structures. These are remnants of structures that served an important function in the organism's ancestors. And anatomy helps us trace their evolutionary history, but maybe they don't necessarily use them now. An example of this is a salamander that lives in a cave. It's dark. It doesn't really need to see, but has these like eyes that are sort of there, even though they don't necessarily need them, or they function to help them see. And then when we look at whales, there's actually this tiny part that indicates a hind limb, right? Well, whales aren't really using these hind limbs, but we can see when they look at the structure of them that it is still there, suggesting some relationship, but it has evolved differently as a species, as a population, where it doesn't necessarily use that anymore. We can also look at how organisms develop, right, or embryological homologies, things that they have in common. When we look at how all vertebrates really develop, we notice some commonalities in the embryos as they develop. How do they look the same, even just from looking at these pictures? And that suggests that maybe they have some common ancestors. Now, when we say common ancestors, we're not necessarily talking about related to, like we think of now. Actually, it just means like things in common, essentially, and they can be very, very far away. But they're things that we notice that maybe tell us that there is this idea of common ancestry and evolution, one thing being related, if you will, ish to another. Okay, then we have biochemical evidence. When we look at things, almost all living organisms use ATP and DNA and specific enzymes. We all have the same triplet code for amino acids, right? And then when we look specifically at eukaryotes, we have membrane-bound organelles. We have things like chloroplasts and mitochondria, and how we use them in cellular respiration and photosynthesis that really helps us relate organisms together. Linear chromosomes in all eukaryotic organisms, genes that contain introns and exons in eukaryotes, and even some common genes like cytochrome C that's used in respiration, or hemoglobin that's used in gas exchange that we see in lots of organisms, suggest this idea of evolution. And then finally, now we have the ability to look at actual DNA sequences and compare those specific DNA sequences and those protein structures, right? Remember, DNA and RNA are kind of universal codes. Basically, everything uses it. And now we have the ability to really quickly sequence those codes and look even for single nucleotide changes that tells us about relationships among organisms. And like more changes would mean, I like to say, more different, right? Not proper English, but kind of how it works, right? And so eventually we're going to work on creating phylogenetic trees, right? And so things that are more close together are more closely related, or say share what we call a same line of descent, until they're divergent from a common ancestor, until we start to see traits that kind of differentiate them from each other. But now, right, we can look at DNA, and especially DNA that has been preserved, and really use us to help to put together the puzzle pieces, which before we didn't have, right? We had to use a lot of that other evidence, specifically with fossils, in order to put together these puzzle pieces. I hope that gives you a better idea about what scientists use as evidence for evolution, and even more specifically, how we're going to use that to kind of piece together how organisms might be related to each other. Have a great day.